So this all started from an observation that in distributed systems, it's common to have users taking random actions with a particular bias in order to achieve some kind of overall system behavior. And so this is, of course, modeled as just a Bernoulli trial or just a biased coin flip. And so we created the concept of a blind Bernoulli trial. So with this, our goal is for one party to be able to create an encrypted coin that can be distributed to a large number of users, and each user can use this to perform one Bernoulli trial, obtain one result, without learning the bias of the coin flip. And during this presentation, I'll be focusing on our efficient realization of this using inter-product encryption. So we talk about a couple of examples of potential applications in our paper, but I'm going to focus on one example here, which is the AP3 anonymous communication network. And this is just a network that uses a random walk through the network to hide the sender of a message. And the random walk is driven by a biased coin flip at each step. So that looks something like this. We have a user who wishes to send a message to another user. The sender is, say, Alice in green here on the left. And note that also both users here are also part of the network. So when Alice wants to send a message, she first selects a random node and sends the message to that node. Then that node does a random coin flip with a certain bias, and depending on the result, the node either forwards it to another random node or it forwards that message to its actual recipient. So in this case, say the first node gets a heads on its coin flip, so it chooses to send that to a new random node. And this process continues through the network until, by chance, one node finally gets a tails, and so that node then sends the message to its actual recipient. So notice that there's a trade-off here. So if we have a higher probability of sending the message to a random node at each step, then we have better anonymity, but we also have longer path lengths. So in terms of anonymity, we're talking about nodes on the path being able to deduce the sender, right? So if the node on the path knows that the probability of mixing the message is relatively low, then it can deduce that the sender is likely very close to it in the network, right? On the other hand, if we use a lower probability of mixing the message, we get shorter path lengths, but we also get reduced anonymity because nodes that are on the path that observe the message can see that the probability of mixing is lower, and they can deduce that the sender is close. So the AP3 is described using a fixed probability for all messages, but instead we observed that you could vary probability by message and achieve differential service. So in our example, we say that you could have slow traffic that uses a higher probability of mixing, meaning that you get longer path lengths, but also higher latency and better anonymity. On the other hand, we have priority traffic that is the opposite. It has shorter paths, it gets there faster, but because the mixing probability is lower, nodes that observe the message can narrow down the sender more easily. And we show a simulation of this in our paper. We use a network quite similar to AP3. And as expected, the priority class traffic in the blue line here on the CDF, the cumulative distribution function, shows that the path lengths for the priority traffic are, of course, much slower or much faster, shorter paths, faster traffic, and the slow class has longer path lengths on average. But of course, we also anonymity suffers quite a bit from this. So we show we measure anonymity as the percentage of nodes that an observer has confidence that the message could have originated from. And so we show that with the priority traffic in our simulation, the anonymity set is about 5% of the network size, whereas with the slow traffic, we have about 60% of of the network size in our anonymity set. Instead, we observe that if we're able to obscure the probability from the nodes that are forwarding the messages, then this attack doesn't work anymore, right? So basically, if a node observes a message and it sees that the mixing probability is low, then it's able to perform this attack. But if a node observes a message and it's unable to distinguish between the priority and the slow traffic, then it's impossible for it to use that information to narrow down the set of senders. And so we showed that under the assumption that an observing node cannot distinguish the classes of traffic, then we get an anonymity set size that's much larger, about 50% of the network. Okay, so that's our motivation. Now let's start with our definition of the problem that we're trying to solve here. More precisely, so we want this to be non-interactive, and that's because our motivating use cases are mainly in distributed systems where an interactive online protocol would be prohibitive for a large number of users all having to communicate with a centralized system. So we want this to be non-interactive. Secondly, we want this to be per user deterministic. So that means each user who gets a trial result for a trial must get the same result every time. Otherwise, the user can just repeat the trial over and over, and then you have a good estimate of the probability for that trial, right? Finally, this leads us to our third conclusion, which is that we need some kind of authority to manage the users. Otherwise, in the exact same way, if I can obtain multiple user identities and I can perform multiple trials, then I can start to deduce the probability of each result. So starting with these three ideas, we distill the concept of the blind Bernoulli trial into three algorithms. The first here is the key generation phase. And so here we have some kind of trusted authority who's using a master secret key. The master secret key enables the authority to generate individual user keys, and then those user keys can be distributed to any number of users in the network. The second is called tag generation, where a tag represents the parameters for a Bernoulli trial, which is really just the probability of each result. And so any person can create a new tag, and they do that by selecting the probability that they want associated with that tag, and then they can distribute the tag to the network. The third algorithm is the trial, and this is where, given one user key and one tag, I can compute, any user can compute a single random Bernoulli trial result. So in this way, we have the overall distribution of results in the network is approximately the probability that's selected by the one who generates the tag, but each individual user sees only a single result, and they gain no more information about the probability of the results than absolutely necessary. And so that leads us to our security definition. So to formalize the security of this, we start from the idea that simply an adversary with some number of keys should learn no more from those keys and a tag than they would from having access only to those trial results instead. And more formally, we can turn that into a definition based on the probabilistic polynomial time adversaries. And we say that the difference between these two adversaries must be negligible, where the only difference in the inputs of the adversaries is that one has the actual tag T as input, and the second has only the trial results associated with that tag as input, plus a leakage function, where the leakage function quantifies and gives a theoretical bound for any additional information that is leaked in a non-theoretically ideal system. To construct this, well, we show in the paper, we talk about three different constructions, including a couple of strawman constructions. One of them is that, first, you can do this with general functional encryption, but of course, we know that's not really practical right now. So instead, the main solution that we focus on is using a special case of functional encryption called inner product encryption. First, some background on IPE, inner product encryption. This is just a special case of functional encryption that works for inner products only. So here, each function key is associated with a vector, and each ciphertext is associated with a vector. Then, given a function key and a ciphertext, you can decrypt that ciphertext if and only if the vectors are orthogonal. Specifically, we use a stricter definition of IPE called fully attribute hiding IPE. And this requires, additionally, that the ciphertext does not reveal its associated vector, even when the ciphertext is able to be decrypted. So to construct our blind Bernoulli trials with this, it's a fairly straightforward mapping. User keys are just IPE function keys, and we generate those function keys using a fixed number of non-zero components in the vector, but we shuffle the vectors within that, or the components within that vector randomly for each user key. So tags become IPE ciphertexts, where we vary the number of non-zero components in the ciphertext to control the probability that any given user key will be able to decrypt that ciphertext. So you can imagine that a tag with only a single non-zero component has a much higher chance of being orthogonal to any given user key compared to a tag that has a vector with several non-zero components. And then because the IPE scheme is fully attribute hiding, the vector associated with the ciphertext is hidden from the users, even the ones who are able to decrypt it. So then, of course, the trial just becomes an attempted IPE decryption. So the user can take their key and attempt to decrypt the tag. And if the decryption succeeds, then they learn basically whether or not their key is orthogonal to that tag or not. And we prove the security of this in the standard model by reducing it to the security of the IPE scheme that we use. And we use our previously mentioned definition, and we show that given the first adversary, it's possible to construct a simulator that uses only the trial results such that the outputs of the two are computationally indistinguishable using the leakage function of the IPE public key. So given the IPE public key, it's possible for the simulator adversary to construct a fake tag that's functionally identical to the real one. And then the simulator can just feed that fake tag to the original algorithm. And of course, those outputs must be indistinguishable. Otherwise, we would have broken the definition of the attribute hiding IPE. OK, so that's the sort of the theoretical understanding of the security. But it's still worth asking, what is the practical security of something like this, right? Because we know, first of all, that even one trial result always reveals some information about the probability. And we also want to learn how much does an adversary learn from a single trial, or how much would they learn from collusion, even in the worst case. Secondly, we have to look at the practical security specifically of the IPE scheme, because we've shown that it's not perfect security because the leakage function is the IPE public key. And so what that means in practice is that a user who had access to the IPE public key would be able to use that to learn the arrangement of components in any user keys that it has. So this reveals the components in the user key, but not in the tags. And we know that so given this information, an attacker could narrow down the set of possible tag vectors that it's looking at to only those that would be consistent with its set of user key vectors. But we know that an attacker cannot possibly do any better than this, just by the definition of the IPE security. So, okay, to look at the practical security impact of this, we performed a simulation using two different attackers. The first is we call a component-aware attacker, and this one models the security of the IPE scheme by using the full knowledge of the user key components, which is the theoretical possible amount of information an adversary could have given our proof. And the second models the ideal security. We call it the naive attacker, and it models the ideal security because it uses only the trial results to try and infer the tag. So for this experiment, we use 4 probability tiers, and based off the IPE construction, we modeled an IPE scheme with 64 dimensions, and we selected these 4 possible tags with, for example, using 9 non-zero components in a tag would result in a probability of success of the trial of 0.725, and all 4 of these tags were equally likely to be given to the adversary. So as far as the adversary is concerned, before performing any trials on a tag, that tag is equally likely to be any of these 4. So these are the results for an attacker with increasing number of user keys who's running trials with each of those user keys and then using that information to try and deduce which of the 4 tags it had. And so given that we start with 4 tags at equal probability, the prior entropy of that distribution is 2 bits. And you can see that, as you'd expect, with the number of trials increases, the adversary gains more information, and the entropy of that distribution starts to decrease from the adversary's perspective. But we see that the IPE case reveals slightly more information, and so the entropy of that distribution decreases a little bit faster. Although using the Kullback-Leibler divergence, we show that the difference in information between those models starts to level off at about 10 keys, surprisingly. So this is just a measure of the difference in information between 2 models, and we show that the difference between the naive attacker and the component-aware attacker it starts to plateau after a certain point. Finally, we did an implementation of this so we could get some benchmark numbers. We used a recent IPE scheme that's fully attribute hiding, secure in the standard model due to Chen, Gong, and Wei. And in this scheme, all the algorithms are linear in the number of dimensions of the IPE scheme, although the trial algorithm is dominated by just the constant number of pairings that are involved, with 7 pairings. And so these are our numbers. For the setup phase and the tag generation phase, these are the slowest algorithms, and we're in the realm of a few seconds here. But the trial algorithm in particular is the one that we're most interested in because that's the one that all the users on a network would be running repeatedly for each tag. And so here we see that we're in the realm of about 30 milliseconds or so for a trial. All right, and that concludes my talk. So now I'll take any questions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So it seems that in your solution, to get a probability of 1/n, you need ciphertext of length n. Have you considered, is there a way to maybe use to get shorter ciphertext depending on the probability, so maybe logarithmic or something like that?
So the availability of different probability options is something we discuss a lot more in the paper. And so if you using the inner product scheme, you're basically limited by the number of components that are available there, right? And so I don't really see a way around that except for using something completely different, some other completely different kind of construction. And we do talk about of course, the general functional encryption construction, and in that case, we're able to achieve arbitrary probabilities regardless of without longer ciphertext. But yeah, in this case, I think that is a limitation.
Thanks.
I just have one question. So this looks a little bit like, I don't know, think about a group signature where you have an authority that gives out keys. Is there potentially an equivalent of this where you basically do untrusted setup where, let's say, I can identify a group? Is that something that can be built even with very strong tools? Like I pick my users, there's no trusted authority. Just every time I send out a tag, I can do it then. It's okay if the answer is I don't know.
Yeah, that seems possible in principle. Yeah, I don't think we really examined that in this work, but I don't see why that wouldn't be possible in principle.
All right, let's thank the speaker one more time.